Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to our book club. And what month are we at? In March. Exciting how fast this year is going. We have Tracy Caruso to discuss the book Hamnet. So welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Tammy. It's so good to see all of you. I feel like we just had this discussion a moment ago, but just kidding for all of you out there. It is so good to be back, and it's great to be able to facilitate this discussion. And I'm really eager to see how you all felt about this book. But before we launch into discussion, I want to go over an overview of this book, what it was about, some things about the author, stuff like that. So Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, it's a historical fiction novel published in 2020 by the Irish-British author Maggie O'Farrell. It fictionalizes the life of William Shakespeare's family at the time of his son Hamnet's death in 1596 and the writing of the play Hamlet around 1600. Hamnet has won numerous awards in 2020 and 2021, including the Women's Prize for Fiction, a prestigious literary award in the United Kingdom, as well as the National Book Critics Circle Award, ALA Notable Book, and the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. Hamnet is essentially a family type of drama, telling the background between William Shakespeare and his wife, Agnes. It follows their relationship as they deal with their grief over the death of their son, Hamnet, the implications of Will's career and Will's infidelity. One review describes Hamnet as a luminous portrait of marriage, a shattering evocation of a family ravaged by grief and loss, and the tender and unforgettable reimagining of a boy whose life has been all but forgotten, and whose name was given to one of the most celebrated plays of all time. Hamnet is mesmerizing, seductive, impossible to put down, and magnificent leap forward from one of our most gifted novelists. So let's talk a little bit about Maggie O'Farrell before we do a deep dive into what this one is about. Maggie O'Farrell was born in Northern Ireland in 1972. She grew up in Wales and Scotland and now lives in Edinburgh. She has worked as a waitress, a chambermaid, a bike messenger, a teacher, an arts administrator, and a journalist in both Hong Kong and London. I think her life is actually fascinating, and I hope that we see an autobiography from her soon. As a deputy literary editor of The Independent on Sunday, she is the author of After You've Gone, The Lover's Lover, The Distance Between Us, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, The Hand That First Held Mine, Instructions for a Heat Wave, This Must Be the Place, I Am, and most recently Hamnet. And she does have another book that's coming out in September, I believe. So the novel comprises two alternating narratives. The first begins with the events leading up to Hamnet's death in 1596, while the second describes the events between Hamnet's parents meeting at his birth. The first narrative of the novel opens with 11-year-old Hamnet discovering that his twin sister Judith is ill with fever and buboes, egg-shaped bulges under her skin. He tries to find the physician and his mother Agnes, who is a healer, but both are absent. His grandparents are too distracted while his father, a playwright, is away in London. When Agnes and the physician arrive, the latter expects that Judith will die. Agnes, who is more successful healer than the physician, attempts all the cures she knows in order to heal her daughter. The family is unaware that the origin of Judith's sickness was the faraway meeting of Venetian glass merchant with a flea that fell off the back of a monkey in Alexandria, Egypt. Hamnet is showing symptoms of illness, but no one notices these. As Hamnet cannot bear the thought that his twin will die while he continues to live, he makes a pact with death. He swaps clothes with Judith and vows to take her place as death's victim. Agnes wakes up to find that the dying twin is Hamnet and not Judith. There is nothing she can do to save him. The second narrative of the novel begins with the meeting of Hamnet's parents. His father is a Latin tutor and the son of a disreputable glove maker, while his mother is the daughter of a deceased yeoman and forest-dwelling healer. By the time Agnes meets the Latin tutor, her mother is dead, and she is in service to her stepmother, Joan, who is intimidated by Agnes's psychic and healing abilities. When Joan opposes a marriage between the Latin tutor and Agnes, the couple have sex. That's right, I said it. They had sex. Their union results in a pregnancy and a rushed marriage with John, the Latin tutor's father, favors because it lessens his debt to the deceased yeoman. Agnes goes to live with the Latin tutor and his family in the town of Stratford. In accordance with her dead mother's guidance, she gives birth to the first baby, Susanna, in the forest. Over time, Agnes gains a reputation for her healing powers. However, when Agnes is pregnant with her second baby, she's troubled by her inability to divine the child's sex and by her husband's restlessness and depression. She senses that he needs to get away from confining Stratford and go to London. Agnes originally plans to follow him there after she gives birth. When Agnes gives birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith, she is afraid, owing to the psychic feeling that she was only meant to have 2 children and not 3. She determines that she should oppose fate and ensure all 3 of her children's survival. As Judith is a frail child, Agnes maintains that London would kill her, and so she decides that they will stay in Stratford. Subsequently, the children grow up apart from their father, who becomes an increasingly successful playwright. The final part of the novel chronicles the aftermath of Hamnet's death. While a devastated Agnes mourns her son at home, her husband feels that he must escape his grief in London. Although he still visits from home periodically and acquires a bigger house for his wife and remaining daughters, he grows further apart from them and is unfaithful to Agnes. A few years later, when Agnes finds out that he wrote a play bearing their dead son's name, she's horrified. Determined to see the work, she finds that the play is her husband's means of resurrecting Hamnet and consoling himself over the loss of the child. Hamnet opens with some historical notes: a couple in Stratford and 3 children, twins Hamnet and Judith, and daughter Susanna. Hamnet died in 1596 at age 11. Roughly 4 years later, his father writes the play Hamlet, a name that is interchangeable at the time with the name Hamnet. I never quite understood that, but that's what I read repeatedly, that the 2 names are interchangeable. As the story unfolds, the book tells a fictionalized story of William Shakespeare and his wife Agnes and the death of their son. So a brief historical note: in the 1580s, again, a couple living in Stratford, England, they had the twins Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet, the male twin, died in 1596, and about 4 years later, his father wrote a play called Hamlet. Again, the name is interchangeable with Hamnet, according to the Stratford records. So they like to bring up this point over and over again, but that's how, that's really the historical fiction part of this. So the first thing I'd like to open this up to is, did you guys like this book? What did everyone think? And I'll let Tammy unmute anyone who wants to talk. You know, I'm going to guess that Ruth Levitan.
Let's not put her on the spot. Tracy, what did you think? What were your thoughts about the book before we head on to our group? Tell us about what you think.
Well, my feeling of the book, you know, it's very interesting. The reason why I actually picked this particular book was I picked a couple of books that were on the list from the woman who used to lead your book club. And this one happened to be one of the ones that was on that list. So because I wanted to keep all of this diverse and I wanted to, you know, get to know all of you and see what you think of different types of things, I thought I'm gonna put this one in and I'm gonna see what you all think of it. Now, the book it's widely acclaimed, as you know. Everyone that I know who has read it loves it, thinks it's the greatest book. What I'm going to tell you, in all honesty, is that it was not for me. It's just not my kind of book. It's not, I thought it was overwritten. It wasn't the kind of thing. I enjoyed the themes. I thought the idea was very interesting. And I thought, and this will lead into the discussion, when we lead into discussion about this, I thought it was interesting because of the fact that we're going through COVID now and having to read something that has a plague in it. You're reading about that. I think that's interesting given the time period that we're in now, but it's just not the kind of book that I personally like or enjoy. But I'm curious to know what you think of it, because literally out of everyone I know who has read this book, I'm the only one who didn't like it. So,
Now, do you like
thoughts?
Shakespeare? Are you like did you study Shakespeare? Because I think this
Sure,
book
I
was,
think we all did. I think everybody studied Shakespeare in school. I think that in this group particularly, I'd say that everybody in high school probably read Macbeth. Um, some of you may have read Hamlet, Midsummer's Night's Dream. There's a lot of it, and I do like Shakespeare, and I always had an appreciation for Shakespeare, which is one of the reasons why I thought that I might like it. I was also interested in um, knowing more about his wife, because little is said about her in history. Anne Hathaway, we know the name, but we don't hear a lot about her. So I was interested in hearing about the whole like family dynamic, how they would come up with it. And
yeah.
but it just wasn't my cup of tea personally.
Hey, well, that's
Yeah.
good. So, but yeah, I thought it was really great that we got to know all the characters,
Mhm.
and Shakespeare was set by the wayside. But Mrs. Levitan, did you want to say something?
So I know I wasn't trying to call you out, Mrs. Levitan. I just know that you've got a
No,
lot of
that's
thoughts on
all
this book.
right.
I'm
Well,
dying to hear what you
no,
think.
no, no, that's all right. Um, it's very interesting. You know that sometimes books that win awards, there's a lot of hype and there's politics behind some of these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, if you notice, she won that Woman's Award for the best book. Well, there's a trend happening now where, well, it actually started with Germaine Greer, who's written a book about Hamlet's wife, Hamlet, Shakespeare's wife. And it's a recapturing of the place of women in that time. I listened to an interview of the author, Maggie O'Farrell, and she talked about all the research she did, and you've mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
And she recreated the life, because believe it or not, all the papers exist about William Shakespeare's father, who was a very prominent man in Stratford and fell from grace. And the whole family was living on the margins. So that part is true. But what nobody really knows, and because women have been largely written out of history, and as Maggie O'Farrell said in this one interview, by misogynists, and I mean, it's like centuries. So we're talking about, there he was, the most famous playwright, and it suits people to think of him as a man who was free of his wife and could go and live in London and cavort with other women, write plays, and lead the life that we know that actors lead today, and playwrights maybe. But I think the story that she was trying to get at was that the life was more complicated. And I mean, I don't even want to discuss with you Maggie O'Farrell, the way she's put the book together, her use of language. She's being honored and lauded for her use of language. The way she sets up scenes, you can almost smell the forest. You can feel the pain. I mean, she's a wordsmith. She's fabulous. But most of the women that I know, when we really get to talking about it, don't like the book. It doesn't.
Really? So you mean it's not just me?
No, because it doesn't
Keep
speak.
going.
It doesn't speak. It didn't speak to me.
Mm-hmm. You didn't
And
relate to it. You didn't feel it.
No.
Yeah.
And there were other women that I've met along the way who felt the same way. And, it would be interesting if Joyce were alive. I could just picture what she would be doing, because she would really be talking to us about the place of women at that time. And, you know, Maggie O'Farrell referred to it because Agnes, her name was actually Agnes, and she sort of lived on the fringes. That she was tolerated because she could heal. She was a herbalist. But don't believe, you know, at that time they were afraid of witches. They were very superstitious. They didn't understand illness. Her description of the plague was unbelievable in this book. You know, you alluded to it, you know, a flea on a Murano bead. I mean, go figure. But look at, we're living in the time of COVID. So we, you know, we can understand it, but it doesn't surprise me that you wouldn't like it. And that, and I wasn't overly thrilled. I think a lot of people who really like the book are taken up with the story of grief and loss.
Yeah.
And she portrays it beautifully.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think it's, I think that what you're saying, I think all of it is correct. I think though that for me, part of the problem also might have been that I had such high expectations because I kept hearing so much. Like sometimes that it does it with anything, whether it's a show, a book, a movie. If you go in with incredibly high expectations, you're often let down. And I think that that's part of it. And then you're often, I don't know if this ever happens to any of you, but it does happen to me. Sometimes I'll read a book that is very popular and getting a lot of buzz and people really love it. And I'm sitting there reading it. And while I'm reading it, I'm thinking to myself, why don't I feel what other people are feeling with it? Like you start to think like there's something wrong, even though it's just a taste thing and an opinion thing and how you resonate with the characters or the situation. And sometimes also when you're reading a book, like it's interesting, like about, you were mentioning the grief and the loss and how it's described. Sometimes when you're reading something, it will hit you at either just the right time or just the wrong time when you're reading a book. Have any of you ever noticed that? Like you might read something, not just, you know, this book, I'm talking about any book. You happen to read something where right at that moment, it's either exactly what's going on or something that you were just through or something that you've been thinking about, or you're at a crossroads in your life, whatever it is. And the particular thing that you're reading just hits you that way at that time. And then you think it's great. Then maybe a number of years later, it's 10 years later, you're like, you know what, I'm going to go back and read that book. It's one of my favorite books, whatever. You go back and you read it and you're like, why did I like this thing? Like, it's just not the same because you don't necessarily, you may have changed, and where you are in your life also can make a book resonate in a completely different way. And you may just not feel that connection to it. So it's very interesting. I think that's, if you feel it with some of the things in this book, then you're like, yes, that it's for me. Otherwise you don't. And I agree with you about the place of women and what that meant in this book, and about women and how they would connect with this. I just didn't feel that, but I'm hoping that some of you did. Is there anyone on here who loved the book, as most did, based on the awards and the hype that this book has gotten? Does anyone feel that they loved it?
Mrs. Fetter, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. I liked it. I didn't love it. But
Yeah.
in context, I've been in the closet for the last 2 years. Costco and Publix has been it. This was a trip to England, and her descriptions, her details, the things that you learned about, you know, she had to research it, was amazing. You were there. She brings you there. Then the smells, there's a lot of smells. And you have to think about that, because just horses alone, the smells. My daughter lives in Ohio, where there's a lot of Amish. They go with their horses. You can smell it. It's not even near you, but there is a smell. We're not used to that because we've come cleaner. Our life is so much cleaner. So she brings that to us. And at that time, that I enjoyed. And I never would have read the book, but I'm glad I read it.
Well, that's probably,
well
that's
done.
the reason, for this book club reading, really. And we all know this. It's like the idea of you're reading a book, you're reading certain books that you may never have read. So sometimes it's a hit.
I think she said,
Sometimes it's a miss.
I think she said Hamnet, because if she said Hamlet, we would all think, oh, it's the play.
I think you're right.
And that made a conversation out of it, and that did it. That was very clever on her part. I didn't know they interchanged it. I just thought she made it up, but I thought that, yeah. So that was, and it's interesting to hear other people's response, but it's feminist. She's obviously beyond her days, thinking about health and challenging some of the stupid things that we know happened in the Middle Ages and even not too long ago. And right behind you is Wonder Woman. I'm looking at her as I'm watching you. So it's fitting. That's Wonder Woman is fitting for you and for the book.
What was the last question? I'm sorry. You were saying about Wonder Woman and how did it what to me?
No, she was saying that it resonates because it's behind you.
Yeah.
And you are a Wonder Woman person. So it's very apt. And it was a good read. It's a good read. Not sorry I read it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And so I want to ask a bunch of you a lot of questions because it's interesting. Ms. Fetter brought up, for example, the smells and how that was something that she really, really got. The descriptions are pretty unbelievable. I wanted to know, what did any of you know about the origins of Hamlet and about the history of William Shakespeare, his life, his family before reading the novel? Did any of you know any of that?
You knew he was, she didn't go to London, that she lived in Stratford. And when we were in England, we went to the house. We had the girls I had two young girls at the time, but we did historical sites and that was one of them. And I remembered it was a big house when they were describing the little place that she lived. And then also family interactions, the control that the parents had and the limits that they placed on everybody. In some ways, some of that hasn't changed either with some of the rigid attitudes. Think about it. So that's more of today, not so ancient. And you can pick that out in relationships too. It was interesting, not boring.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to see how the family was depicted. Because again, I knew about that he had Anne Hathaway. I knew about the wife, but I haven't read a lot about the family history. And it was interesting to see this type of interpretation. I wanted to know, what did you all think of the idea? Maggie O'Farrell made a choice in here, and she did this device where she switched Hamnet with Judith, and that's the reason why Hamnet died. Do you think that this was a successful choice? Did you guys like that? Did you think it worked?
No.
Yeah,
I thought that was very theatrical.
Yeah, very unrealistic
and not believable. Not believable.
Yeah.
But she's pushing you. I thought the end when he says the last words, remember me. And I am reading now Jamie Raskin's book, biography, memoir. And he talks about his son constantly. And I guess there's a thing, God forbid you lose a child. There is that constantly. Most people don't even want to talk about it when you lose it. They don't bring it up at all. But obviously there's something there. I don't know where she got that from, but that one just sort of rang a bell when I got to that. And especially since I'm reading this now, which interactions in life, we're learning all the time. This was a learning. And she brought you to that.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. You bring up the idea of losing a child. I mean, the idea, it's I think the reason most people don't want to talk about it is it's really the unthinkable. It happens to people, but it's so against the natural order of life that people don't, it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with and discuss. I mean, as we know, when it happens to people, let's say they lose a young child, often their marriages can't survive it, they can't handle it. I mean, it's just, it changes the course of your entire life. But I remember even when, like you lose an adult child, it's just something that people can't deal with. Like I remember my mom had one brother, and the way life worked out, her brother died 6 months before my grandmother did. And I remember thinking, God, why did it have to work out that way? Because it was so terrible for my grandmother, to see her son go before she did. And then it happened such a short time before it happened to her. For that to happen, it's just a terrible thing. And it's just not something, most people talk about. Is there anyone here who can, and not that, and you're under no obligation to talk about it, but is there anyone here that can relate to that aspect of the story? A child dying, do you know anyone who that's happened to?
So, well, Mrs. Anybody? I'm going to unmute Mrs.
Yeah,
Fetter.
I could speak to that one.
Okay, Mrs. Gorin.
Okay, good. I can't tell. It's hard for me on mine to see who's speaking. Okay, Mrs. Gorin, thank you.
Yeah, I could speak to that one because I lost my husband at age 62 and his mother lived to be 101. And so this was very difficult for both of us. And I happened to be very close to my mother-in-law because I met my husband at 16 in high school. And but after I lost my husband, my mother-in-law had really changed and sort of changed towards me. So then I felt like I lost two people. We did connect at before she died, but it's very, very painful. And I think when you lose a child, I have a friend who just lost her son at age 52, 2 weeks ago, her only child. And I've had friends who've lost, children. You just, I don't think you ever recover. You live, you try to live. Even for me, I was one of the first people, it was just 59 when I lost my husband. And I had not been single since I was 16. And I found there wasn't much of a place for me. It was just very difficult for my life. The lucky thing was that I was teaching and I remained teaching till I was 72. That was my best break in the world. So I think it's very hard for a parent. I watched my mother-in-law grapple with this. She had she had two other children, so that was okay. I have a dear friend, just I told you 2 weeks ago, lost her only child. I don't know how I don't know how you get over this. And it was very sudden. So I think, so in the book, I think I understood a lot of it. And also getting to the book, I've spent my life doing equal rights for women. Do we still have equal rights? We don't. Women are still held back. I mean, for me, I had trouble getting a job because I got married in my junior year in college. Couldn't get a job because I was married. Had to go to work in Boston, very substandard pay, everything. Then I was having a baby. That was even worse. I was eliminated. So I did spend a lot of my career working on this. Have we succeeded? I don't know how other women feel. We still have a long way to go because it still is not equal pay. I'm happy to see that the sports people, young women in particular, are now getting more pay than the men who do exactly the same thing. So there's a lot in this book that I really could identify with. And I think as you talked about the witches, because I came from Massachusetts with Salem and all of that stuff. So you think that you have this person who's a healer, which is a wonderful thing, but maybe they think that she had some things that weren't wonderful. So a lot of the book, I thought really, I can't say I enjoyed all of it. I always thought of Shakespeare as being an honorable man. I didn't know, because I don't know how many men have affairs, or any of that. But I just sort of thought he was beyond that. But maybe, that's foolish thinking.
I think
Obviously he wasn't.
Yeah, I think I think that your thoughts on this are, it's very correct and interesting, and in the lens of equal rights and where we are today and the being held back. And yeah, that's an interesting perspective also, that you're from Boston. So yeah, that whole, like, you probably heard your whole life about the witch trials of Salem.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And I mean, and yeah, so it really, because the most interesting place is to go to Salem during Halloween. You see hundreds of thousands of people dressed up, and they're just, it's an experience that probably most people wouldn't know, but we've done it a few times, and it's interesting. And going, to think of people, witches and all of that stuff. And of course, we recognize what a wonderful thing it is to be a healer, to be able to, heal someone by your actions and your thoughts. We know that better now, but we still have people that are suspicious.
Yeah, that's true.
But there is a place for women who are alone. We even have it here at Glen Eagle. I mean, that we have, we could be ostracized because you're alone. I've not felt it much, but I know people around here who have felt it. So it is different if you don't have that man with you. How do you cope? And I'm sure all the people that have read any stories about that, I would say that it's not easy. It's up to your individual, but you're not always welcome. I've spoken to many women here at Glen Eagle who feel that they are not always part of the scene because they are not with a man.
Oh, that's terrible. It's still that way. But you said that they have a group for, are women able to connect with each other who have gone through the same experience? Because let's face it, we know that women outlive men. Even if, your situation was, quite unusual. Your husband died young, and you were young. So it's a more unusual situation, really hard to cope with. I can actually relate to that because my parents both died when I was in my 30s, and I'm an only child. And when that happened, it was like I knew no one who had the same kind of situation. There was absolutely no one who could relate to me, my experience, and it was a very lonely experience. So I can actually understand. I can really understand some of what you might, you were probably feeling at the time. But women do tend to be the ones that are left behind. And I think it's important for them to be able to support each other and make a place for each other. So at Glen Eagles, are you saying that they do have a thing where women who are single, alone, whatever, that they were able to get together?
Tammy is arranging a singles group. I mean, I am not about to be going to, and I can't.
I don't really mean single. I mean, just that women, I should say women who are uncoupled, because I don't mean because you want to meet somebody else in that way, but that you just want to be around other women that are in the same situation.
No. So, no, we currently, if they do, it's probably just on their own. But let's go back to our book. Is there something happy that we can pull out of it? Hang on, Mrs.
Yeah.
Let me unmute you.
My next question, I'm going to ask my next question. That's like, it's less about grief. This book though, Tammy, that's what it's about. It's about grief. There's a lot of sadness in it. It's from the time, but something I'd like to bring up that I thought was interesting because it relates to today's time period is they talk about the plague. Which I think a few years ago, none of us really would have been able to relate to this in the same way. But in today's day and age, because of COVID, we're in a whole different world reading this book through a whole different lens of experience. So, they talk about it in the novel about how the inhabitants of England during the time of the novel, how it felt by the families that had it. They even talked about the signs of infection that were visible. What about this and the way they talked about it in the book, what about this felt familiar because of the time we're living in now? And do you think that you would have looked at this book differently if you had read it before COVID existed?
Well, first of all, my title says A Novel of the Plague. And I really didn't think there was that much plague in it.
Yeah, it was almost like a background part of it.
Yes, and the Black Death, as historically, is connected to fleas and health, cleanliness. And I remember at that time, because of that, fewer Jews died because Jews washed their hands, and on the Sabbath they cleaned their houses, whereas these people never bathed or whatever. So the difference would be, how come they survived? Then there was a rise historically, anti-Semitism, and after that they threw out. There were no Jews in England. That when he wrote Merchant of Venice, there were no Jews in England. They'd been thrown out and killed and whatever, gone. But the one thing I was thinking about is our grandparents. They would have many children, and then they would lose some. We are so lucky that our science has given us, number one, control of how many children, and also how to care for them. That generally, it's not a common thing the way it was then. But I remember being told when I was young, and it's haunted me, that they get used to it. They get used to a loss of a child. They know that they're going to have 9 children and maybe 5 or 7 will survive. And I always think, how do you ever get used to something like that? I don't care whatever is going on in your life, that it hasn't changed. And that hasn't changed in 500 years or 200 years or 50 years.
That's true. I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. I mean, it's not that long ago that that a lot of this happened. I mean, I remember my grandfather came from a family of 10, and a few of them had, you know, died when they were little. It might have been one of the reasons people wanted to have a ton of children, because you just didn't know the survival rate. I mean, obviously people didn't live as long. You know, it's a whole different world. And I guess, you know, in a way, we are very lucky to be living in the time that we're living in, because these things are very unexpected now. We just don't expect things to like that.
Except statistically, when they say they did live long, some that lived long, the numbers making it lower was because so many children died, so many babies died. So that averaged it out. But there was a lot of that loss kind of thing. And they assumed that, okay, that was the way it is. And you just suck it up, nothing. And I know anybody that lost a child, they never get over it. That's such a terrible.
You know, my next question is, the author chooses to tell the story from the perspective of Agnes, as opposed to her very, very famous husband. They don't even name him in the book. He's just sort of like, you know, this other character, like, it's like the fact that he's the most famous playwright that ever lived, and was even, you know, during this time was becoming so famous. Why do you think the author chooses to do this through Agnes's perspective? And why do you think she chooses not to actually name him in the book?
Because she's a feminist. I'm looking at Wonder Woman. She made the woman. She made the woman the star, not the man. She doesn't even name him.
Is that what the not naming him is? It's the way of making it.
I felt, and I said, take that, William Shakespeare.
I like that. I like that feminist idea. And does anyone else have any thoughts on that? And Tammy gets to look to see if it is, because I can't see it from my.
See anybody, but everybody, you can unmute yourselves. But I mean, we just while we were waiting, we had a review on Hamnet, and the person explained that it was to get to know all the other people, the family members, and that was really in-depth description, and that Shakespeare was to see him in another light, to forget that he was a famous playwright, that he was a father, and that he was human, and to humanize him rather than to but like you said, you know, he's so famous, but I think not naming him kind of like put him in the backstory and let us see him as a different perspective, and gave us a whole new feeling for him and his family and how he was as a father and a husband.
It's now absolutely, all of that is absolutely true. And what Mrs. Fetter said was very true. I like the idea of the feminist perspective of it, that, you know, he, by not even naming him, he's made to be not as essential. It's not his book. It's not him. And everything was revolved around men, and everything we read about Shakespeare is revolved around Shakespeare, which makes sense. I mean, he's the famous one. He's the famous playwright. It's, you know, it's a very interesting perspective. What I wanted to ask all of you, I think Mrs. Levitan brought this up a little bit in the beginning. don't know if you know this, but the author, Maggie O'Farrell, she visited Stratford upon Avon and did extensive research about what is known about Shakespeare's family. And she did this to authentically portray domestic life in small town Tudor England. Do you think she was successful at doing this? And are there any descriptions or moments that particularly stuck with you? Anyone have any thoughts on that, about her depiction of England? She actually went and visited and did the research. She didn't just do the research, she immersed herself in the world. Any thoughts?
Okay. She tells you what it takes to cook food, to gather food, to drive someplace. The trip to London, what it took, which we probably did in an hour and a half, 2 hours, took days. If he couldn't get a horse, he was walking. And then she had detail after detail in it. And she made pictures. When you read the book, that's why I said I was there. And that's what I enjoyed about it, because it's still more of getting out of Glen Eagles and going into the world a little bit. And she did an excellent job of, because her research was remarkable.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, that part of it I thought was unbelievable. I mean, her descriptions were amazing, and to be able to know the parts of it that were accurate. And I've got mixed feelings about the taking liberties. We don't really know that that Agnes was this healer and that was the main part of the thing, but I think it might have that was her way of being able to drive us to the feminist aspect of the novel, because as Mrs. Gorn mentioned, we have, like, we know a lot about witches and witchcraft and how women were thought of at that time. And those were the ones who were the healers, even though they were thought of as good and bad during that time. That was the career of sorts for women, and they were really the most respected. I mean, they were doctors of sorts. So even though people were scared of them, I think that might have been what the point of that device is, but it's not actually true. So it's like some of this is historical.
That's not true. I just read Braiding Sawgrass.
Yeah.
That's about indigenous healing. It goes back hundreds of years. They would have known that. Willow became aspirin. You didn't go get an aspirin at the drugstore, but you went to somebody, you had a bad headache, you had a fever, you went and you got something to help. They were accurate. Now they're looking back. Why are they in the?
No, I'm sorry. What I meant was that the woman herself, this particular woman wasn't actually known for that. That's what I meant. I don't mean the aspect of the healing, that all is true. I meant that she wasn't. That's the vehicle that they used, and I think for good reason.
Right.
But it's not historically accurate, which I always have mixed feelings with in these books. I mean, well, it's kind of like, we know that clearly, I mean, it might have been an interesting device, but the switching of the twins, we know that didn't happen either. It's there's some devices. I mean, that's what makes it historical fiction, but it's interesting to see the choices of what's real and what's not real, and what works and what doesn't work. So my next question for you is, at the end of the novel, Agnes watches a premiere performance of Hamlet. We discussed this a little bit. It was brought up a little bit. I think Mrs. Fetter brought this up a little bit, with Shakespeare playing the ghost of Hamlet's father. The author chooses to end with the line, quote, "Remember me." Why do you think that O'Farrell chose this out of all the text in Hamlet? What do you think she was trying to convey? We have anyone who had thoughts on that? It was at the end of the book about why she did this.
I thought it was because anybody with an experience of losing a child is remember it. And as I say, a lot of people are afraid. They don't want to make them sad. They don't bring it up. They don't talk about that child. But that's what the parent wants. Remember, this is the anniversary. This is what the person was like. And her ending it with that, I thought was the most powerful thing in the whole book. And when I got to that, it suddenly went, wow. And I thought, well done. Liked it better with that. Didn't love it, but that was very effective and haunting.
What I want to know is, and this is really my last question, what are the consequences of Agnes's encouraging her husband, Will, to go to London? Do you think that she regrets the decision at the end of the book as she's watching Hamlet on stage?
No.
No?
No.
How come? Tell me more. Tell us.
Because first of all, he brings it to life, and she realizes what a genius he is. That's a important thing. Yeah.
So, any last thoughts on Hamnet before I give you some suggested reading? Any last thoughts on Hamnet?
I think you did a good job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You gave us Hamlet and you gave us England, which was a treat.
Good. I'm glad that you felt that.
I would add my last thought. I didn't know he had a child named Judith. That's my name. So I felt very, very young. I did not ever know that.
Yeah, it's fun when you find out things like that, right?
It was an eye opener. That would not be the name I would have thought he would have picked for his child. So
yeah.
In those times,
it must be fun to know that the name was around in the 1500s. Wow.
I know.
Can we have like a share of hands or somebody like letting us know whether or not? I wish I could take a poll real quick. I guess I could, but who liked the book? I mean, Mrs. Wolfish, did you read the book? Just raise your hand if you don't want to talk. If you want to talk, I'd love to hear. Did you like the
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I thought that when it got to the part where she lost her son, I found it very painful to read.
Sure.
I just was really upset by it. And I put the book down for a little while before I could pick it up again.
Thank you. Mrs. Weisberg, you can raise your hand. Did you like the book?
I found it interesting.
Interesting. Okay. Mrs. Hyman?
Let me unmute myself.
I did. I unmuted you.
Okay. You know what? I love the book at the end. Until the end, I was not that fond of the book, but when it ended up where how he showed his grief, how he brought Hamlet to life, and how she understood, that part was beautiful.
Thank you. Mrs. Birnbaum, what did you think of the book?
Well, I read it about 2 months ago and I didn't like it. So I said, I have to read it again to see why I didn't like it. It started out very interesting. And I was very much involved in that. And then I got lost with Agnes and the forest and everything. But when I reread it, the ending was just so powerful. And I really got a different perspective of the whole book. And I ended up liking it. I could have lived without the middle part. That really didn't interest me that much. But I didn't know that much about Shakespeare. I mean, I certainly knew a lot about his plays, but personally, I didn't know that much about him. And I found that part very, very interesting and very, very tender and moving at the end.
Thanks. Thank you. Mrs. Delansky, you're up. Did you enjoy the book?
I found the book weird. I didn't like the part about Hamnet and Judith changing places. That I found very incongruous.
It was a very weird plot device.
Sorry?
It was a very weird plot device. I felt the same way.
And the other thing was that I felt that afterwards, when he spent so much time in London, he was hiding. He didn't want to be part of the family grief, and he figured if he put himself in another place with other people and partying and whatever else he did, he was hiding and trying to not forget, but remove himself from the family dynamic. And but he was always dogged by this this feeling, and that was why he wrote the play, and that seemed to redeem him in everyone's eyes.
That's an interesting thought. Mrs. Perlman, I don't know if you're still on with us, but would you like to tell us whether or not you like the book? Okay.
Are you talking to me?
Kathy Perlman.
Oh,
Nope. Okay. I'm going to go to, again, it's hard to see whether or not people are still on, but Mrs. Hernandez, are you still with us? Did you like the book? Okay. All right. Let's go to the next one. Mrs. Schwartz, did you like the book? All right. It's interesting.
All right,
to
let's go on. Let's go
right.
on. We're getting towards the end here, and I wanted to just give you guys some suggested reading if you are interested in this kind of thing or want something that has sort of this sort of feeling. There's Grendel by John Gardner. Interestingly enough, I read that for school when I was really young, but it's one of the ones that they recommend. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Circe by Madeline Miller. Lincoln and Bardo by George Saunders. The Very Obvious Hamlet by William Shakespeare. I think that some of you who are interested in this might want to actually read the play. 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley, and The Story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Robolewski. So those are the recommended books. And yeah, so I am glad that we read this. I mean, the fact is that my curiosity, and I'm sure it was for a lot of you too, was piqued because this book has gotten so much attention. But it was from the list that that Joyce had originally, which was the main reason why that I chose it. But I always want to have very, very different books. Clearly, this is a very different book than something like Empire of Pain. But we have, so it's good to have a lot of different types of books to read. And I haven't heard from you guys about wanting to do a classic. Any suggestions for that? So maybe we'll do a classic book next season, and I'll take some, and maybe I can get you guys involved in the process of picking some books. We can maybe do that a little more together, have a little more involvement in it. But we do have a totally different book next month. I'm not sure what you're going to think of it, but it's a very different thing than any of the things that you've read here. It's called The Other Black Girl, and it's a very modern book. So I'm going to be very, very curious to see how you feel about it. And then we go back for the book after that, into the Gilded Age. So again, totally different books than anything that we've done thus far. And the next two are totally different than each other. And as mentioned, I'm going to try for our last book club, I'm going to try to get the author of that book to come on and work on the discussion too. Can't make any promises, but I will try to do it. I have spoken to her before, and I think that would be an interesting thing too. So I hope that you guys all love this. I hope you love doing book club, and I'm looking forward to the next month. Any last final thoughts from anyone?
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Tracy.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you very much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks, Tracy, so much. I'm
Thank
going
you
to have to
guys.
go read this book.
Good. For those who haven't, then good. I'm glad you're going to read it, and then I'll be curious to see what you all think. All right, I will see you guys next one. What's our next date? Tammy, I don't
Third
have it
Wednesday.
on. That's
What do we
right,
have?
first Wednesday.
18th? Yep. Yep, it's, oh my Lord, now you're putting me on the spot. Hang on. Let's see what we got. Our meetings are Friday morning book club, and so it's on the third Friday, so April 15th. Oh no, that's now April 15th.
It's April 15th. Okay. So
Mhm.
April 15th it is. I am looking forward to seeing you all then. And the other
Okay,
one,
So that's the day of the first Seder, not an ideal day.
This
it's
is
what?
It's the day of the first Seder, not an ideal day to have book club.
at 10
We
o'clock in the morning. People are going to be
Oh, it's at
getting ready
night,
for
but people are
Passover.
preparing. Yeah.
Pardon? Well, we can find another time
Yes,
to
get
do
it
it.
set.
April. Yes, Miss. Yes.
Do you guys want to think about it? I mean, I'm completely open to, to changing it and whatever you guys do. So if you guys don't like that idea of doing it that day, we can do it on another day. It doesn't matter to me. Just, give me some options and let me know what you guys decide.
But
And we'll do it.
I'll go ahead and send everybody that's on our book club. I'll see if what you think about another date. Mrs. Fetter, did you
I
say?
think, yeah, I think either you're cooking and then you're in the kitchen, so we got that hour.
Make it
And, or you're going to somebody's house, in which case, what difference does it make? So I think it could work, but it's up to
Mrs.
you.
Hernandez, what did you think about the
I
date?
think you should make it either the week before or the week after.
Well.
All right, well, let me go ahead and check my calendar, okay? I want to make it sure that we get as many people to be live and to be here for book club. So, all right, thank you,
Okay,
everybody.
very, very good. Just so you know, I cannot do April 8th, but pretty much other than that, I am all good. So if whatever you guys decide. All right.
Okay, all
Okay.
right.
All right. Thank you
Thank
all so
you.
much. And I'll see you next month, whatever
Okay.
date you decide.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. We'll see you later.